We are all hoping that the old way of doing business in Washington is over and that the status quo has ended. We are entering what could be a new era in our country. So, with much happening in the nation's capital, I wanted to expand beyond our weekly hour-long podcast to bring you short chats with key players in Washington, from the Senate to the House to President Trump's administration. These discussions will dive into the latest on legislation that's making its way through Congress and the efforts within the administration to drive the MAHA agenda forward. I want to bring these back to you, the American people. From overseeing blockbuster corporate mergers to confronting big tech censorship, Brendan Carr commands one of the nation's most formidable agencies, the Federal Communications Commission. He's nicknamed Trump's pit bull by The Hollywood Reporter for his aggressive approach. He doesn't back down from tough fights. We discuss the tension between innovation and regulation and explore what the future holds for the FCC in a world evolving at the speed of AI. Mr. Brendan Carr, thank you so much for joining me today here on Update from Washington. You hold the top position now at the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, but you have been there for quite a while. When did you first start at the agency?
Yeah, thanks so much. Great to be with you. Big fan of everything that you're doing. Actually, I started at the FCC 12 years ago. If you can believe it or not, I actually had hair back when I started at the agency. It was 2012. I got to be a line attorney in the Office of General Counsel. I worked for a commissioner. Then I got to be general counsel of the FCC itself before becoming a commissioner back in 2017, and then getting elevated to chair by President Trump in January of this year. So it's been a lot of different hats at the agency, and I've had a great time here.
It's a very important role. It's considered an independent agency, or that's how it's defined. What makes it independent and under that definition? How is it different from other federal agencies?
Yeah, the best way to think about the FCC is we're sort of like a little mini Congress when it comes to tech and telecom matters. So there's 5 commissioners. Right now we're 2-2. We're waiting for a third Republican commissioner to join, but it's usually 3 people of the president's parties. And there's a statute that Congress passed, the Communications Act, that we're tasked with implementing. And so we'll adopt rules and regulations, everything from trying to support rural broadband to, at least in my view, greater connectivity from space through Starlink. We have a role on national security matters in terms of making sure our networks are secure, including from threats posed by the CCP. And we try to get more spectrum out there as well. These are the invisible airwaves that you need for your smartphone to work to keep up with this, hockey stick of demand. So there's a lot of behind the scenes negotiations and getting that spectrum out there. Historically, what's meant to be independent is you're technically outside of the administration, although that very question is being very hotly debated right now in the courts. There's a case called Humphrey's Executor. It basically comes down to, can the president fire you or not? And actually, the FCC is interesting. The president can fire commissioners, so it's sort of a separate debate because the Communications Act doesn't include any protection on commissioners from being fired. But what I've said from day one is I want to understand 100% President Trump's agenda, and we're running a pretty aggressive one here at the FCC.
Well, thank you so much for that explanation as to what the FCC is. We oftentimes hear about the FCC within the context of Section 230, because this is a piece of the Communications Act that shields companies, media and communications companies, from certain types of liability. In this modern age, where technology and communications are pretty much our entire, I mean, they infiltrate every aspect of our life today. That section has come under scrutiny. In your time at the FCC, how do you think about Section 230? These companies now are so powerful. And I know something that I deeply agree with you on and connect with you on is the role that these tech companies play in censoring certain voices, in really offending what I think are our First Amendment rights to free speech, especially the things that we've learned since the pandemic. You famously wrote a letter to YouTube claiming that there was evidence of censorship of certain American voices. One example was religious voices, and you have found and collected evidence of this censorship. So, given this environment, how are you thinking about Section 230, and what is the FCC's role in ensuring our liberties are protected?
Yeah, thanks so much for the voice that you've been giving to these issues. To your point, when you look at social media companies today, and then you step back and look across the sweep of history, there's never been any set of institutions, no government, that has this much control over this much speech, over this much discourse. And particularly the last 4 years, I think we really saw that power being wielded in a way to shut down viewpoints. I know, for me as a Republican, as a conservative, there's a perception that that was, against conservatives, but I think really it was about any views that were sort of unorthodox, that weren't sort of within the established viewpoint. We saw censorship. And all across the country over the last couple of years, we saw this massive surge in censorship. It really accelerated with COVID. Anytime you have an increase in government control, you necessarily have a decrease in free speech rights, because free speech is democracy's check on authoritarian instincts. There is an important role for the FCC here. So Section 230, as you noted, is in the Communications Act. And in a nutshell, you got it right. It's sort of an immunity protection that allows social media companies to censor, not just within the scope of their First Amendment rights, whatever they may be, but with these bonus protections. And over the years, courts have read immunities into Section 230 that simply aren't in the text. And to go a little deeper there, what's relevant here is there's two provisions of 230. 230C1, which in my view, although some people disagree, in my view, properly read says, if you leave someone else's speech up on your platform, meaning if you don't censor them, then you aren't liable if that speech itself is libelous or tortious. I think that's great. That's what we call a pro-speech provision. It encourages you to host other people's speech, unorthodox speech. The problem I think has come in 230C2, which I think could be read to allow censorship, again, above and beyond what you can do with the First Amendment, just bonus censorship. That's where I think the FCC has a role to step in and say, look, 230C2 isn't as broad or as sweeping as some people may want. Let's leave 230C1 in place. But I don't know why we would have incentives in place for people to censor speech. And frankly, if you step back historically, actually, this was a very liberal, progressive idea, this idea of free speech, of diversity of viewpoints. And in fact, the very first op ed ever launched on the pages of the New York Times back in 1970. There was an editor there, a guy by the name of John Oakes, a traditional progressive. And he said back then that, in his words, diversity of opinion is the lifeblood of democracy. The moment we insist that everyone start thinking the same way we do, our democratic way of life is in jeopardy. And that's why he launched the op ed page, because he wanted divergent views, in his words, views that were different than what you would get from the New York Times. And so for a long time, we had this sort of embrace right, left around diversity of viewpoints. And then something shifted. And again, I think a lot of it was during COVID. My own view is I think a lot of this is downstream of some extreme versions of identity politics, because once you divide people into two camps of, oppressed and oppressor, you don't really need, free speech. You don't really need ideological curiosity. Everyone just gets told what their place is in this society. And this, diverse thought is replaced, and we get this sort of cement of orthodoxy that's planted in people's brain. And I think it's a problem for a lot of reasons. I mean, how do we as a country solve some of our most pressing problems as we think about them? We think about unorthodox ideas, we spin things around. And when you censor words, you're censoring ideas. And I think that's why we have felt, particularly the last 4 years, that there's been a real wet blanket over the country. Even economic activity is suppressed when people feel like they can't share what's on their mind. Again, as a Republican, I think with President Trump coming in, we're seeing a real lifting of that sentiment of suppressed thought. And you've got X that stood in the breach for a long time. You've got Meta Zuckerberg, who did his mea culpa letter last summer saying sorry for all that censorship we did. And I welcome him to the fold of free speech. I think it's good. I think Google could still come a long ways towards embrace of free speech. You mentioned a letter that I sent to YouTube, but there's really a whole broader, censorship cartel, as I call it, that's out there. And it also includes the advertising entities, the marketing entities. They're really sort of enforcing a lot of that censorship. But again, I hope that the wave is past, at least here in the US, there's still challenges abroad. Brazil is having a hard time in free speech, in my view. Europe is heading
The
down sort of
European
a
Digital
darker path
Services
too.
Act. I mean, that was another letter you wrote to the US tech platforms. The European Digital Services Act prohibits and criminalizes certain forms of speech. And you suggested that these companies use something called geofencing in order to continue to operate in those countries because they are subject to those liabilities under this European Digital Services Act, correct?
Yeah, Europe is really at a fork in the road right now. And Vice President Vance gave a great speech, one of his first ones in Europe, sort of laying this out. And really, AI is one microcosm way of thinking about this. So there's two versions of AI that are developing. China is very clear about where they're going with AI. It's going to be very ideologically biased. Just look at DeepSeek. If you ask DeepSeek what happened in Tiananmen Square, they said it was a fantastic day. If you ask them how the Uyghurs are doing, they'll say they're wonderful. They're getting a great education in camp-like settings. I mean, it's a totally distorted version of reality. America, we're going to lead the world with gold standard AI. It's going to be free from ideological bias. And Europe has to choose. Are they with us towards sort of freedom of thought, or are they going to push for ideological bias in these systems? And to your point, there's a law, the Digital Services Act, the DSA, that's effectively requiring U.S. technology companies to censor with respect to speech and services that they provide in Europe. And so, one option, my preferred outcome, is that Europe come our way and embrace free speech, turn away from sort of China style censorship, and let's have one service that goes to US and Europe that's free from censorship. But if that's not going to happen, if that's not the direction Europe wants to go, then yeah, one option I think US tech platforms have to look for is geofencing, meaning a censored, distorted version of their services in Europe, and then sort of the real stuff outside. But Europe is struggling right now. They don't have the economic power or motor that they once had. They're falling behind. I do think that some of the regulators are starting to get that, but they're still challenged to get their regulatory structures updated to have successful technology companies there. It's a hurdle.
You are one of the few people I've met who have connected macroeconomic trends to free speech. And you have really, I think, you're the thought leader on this issue. And the fact that you're the head of our FCC gives me great confidence right now. But I don't think the average person understands that in order to have economic prosperity, abundance, and true innovation, you do need free speech. And we could, innovate incredible in certain areas of AI, robotics, in all of these areas that people are innovating. But if you don't have free speech, that ultimately kicks you down in terms of transferring that into commerce. I don't know if I said that correctly, but would love to hear how you think that through, and especially from the vantage point of being the head of the FCC.
I think you're exactly right, and that's one of the fundamental advantages that historically America has had over authoritarian regimes like the CCP. Again, if you take it back just to AI, what you want an AI system to do is to provide, intuitive responses, real information. And building AI systems require you to question fundamentally different truths, different realities, different facts. And the CCP, that's not sort of built into the mindset questioning and so that's a challenge for them on AI, which is why I think you see them copying a lot of the US technology in this space. And just generally, if you want to build something, if you want to create something new, you've got to think outside the box to do that. And if we're just sort of shutting down innovative thinking, we are also putting a wet blanket over our sort of innovative ideas and our economic output. And that's why I do think, to your point, there is a straight line between free speech and ultimately economic growth. We need dynamic people thinking dynamically, expressing those ideas.
And
Maybe it's a
arguing and
terrible
debating.
idea, but
Yeah.
get it out there and let's talk about it. I think that's how we see some economic breakthroughs as well. That's why, again, I think we see countries that have a lot of suppressed speech. They're not really the ones leading on new innovative ideas either.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're totally right. And in terms of AI security and securing our human liberties in the age of AI, I've oftentimes said America is the place you want to be because we have the Constitution. If we lose the Constitution, we actually run the risk of losing human sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, look, free speech is, foundational to what we are as a country. I do think we sort of went through this real dark period of time, particularly around COVID, and I think we're sort of returning to free speech, and we all have a role to play in that. Again, I think the FCC has a bit of a role there with Section 230. Ultimately, I want more speech, and I think one way to get there is user empowerment, and this sort of complies with the First Amendment. So the idea of the First Amendment is we don't want the government, a central authority, making decisions about what's true and what's not and what you can say and what you can't. I think there's an analog to that in the online space, which is I don't think we should have Silicon Valley companies or frankly companies located anywhere because now we don't have them just in Silicon Valley, which is a good thing, making decisions about who can participate in the digital town square, what you can say. I think just like the First Amendment, we need to move that decision making power back to individual users. And you, as a participant in the digital town square, should be empowered to, mute a conversation, to block words, to not follow somebody. Because if you make a mistake at the system level, that's massive consequences. Look at the Hunter Biden laptop story. There was a central decision made. Some would argue at the FBI, others would argue at Facebook and other places to block discussion of the Hunter Biden laptop story before the 2020 election. And that had massive consequences. Now, if we just said individual people, you can choose to think it's not true and you can block discussion over it. Um, I think we would have been much better off as a country because we always look at like the negative consequence. If someone says this and it's not true, then people are going to do this and it's bad. Okay, you can see that. But people are often blind to the negative consequences that come from things that we aren't allowed to talk about.
And where does that accountability come from? Mark Zuckerberg famously told the world that there were government officials calling him to ask him to censor, especially during the pandemic and in the lead up to the election as well. Um, it's a tough arena around the legal theory on accountability. Is that something the FECC has the power to establish, that if a government asks a big tech platform to censor, that individual has been in direct breach of the First Amendment rights, and those individuals have standing to sue that individual or agency? I mean, how does standing work in this environment?
I do think we should have something like that. There's a law in the books people have probably heard of called the Hatch Act that imposes various limits on government officials, whether it's political speech or endorsing products. There's been some thought about adding to that or a bill similar to that that basically prevents a government official from reaching out to a social media company and suggesting that they censor some sort of post. I mean, I think we saw that over the last couple of years, some of that conduct taking place. To your point, Zuckerberg said it. But I also think we should put a burden on the social media company itself to publicly disclose whenever that happens. Because if there's a prohibition on the government official coupled with a requirement for the private entity to speak up when they feel like they've been pressured, I think that could create the right environment so we don't have that type of pressure campaign going on. But ultimately, I think we are sort of moving into a world in which, individuals, podcasts, direct posting is much more trustworthy right now. I mean, there's just so little trust in the traditional mainstream media. I think part of it is just because we have so much more access to news and information that you can see when a story, ends up not being true at all. So I think it's a great thing that we've got podcasts going, that we've got, social media sites going. There's some downsides to that. Of course, it's robust, it's wide open, it's frothy, but net, I think we're in a better shape than having two or three, network gatekeepers deciding what the news is. It's a learning curve. It's bumpy along the way. The mainstream media doesn't like it, so you see a lot of attacks on anyone that gets popular on social media or popular on podcasts. That's fine. That's sort of the system pushing back on the new entrant. But I think net, we're going to be in a much better shape now that we have this much more sort of diverse access to news and information.
Yeah. Well, we feel very good on the First Amendment, thanks to you leading the charge there at the FCC and to President Trump, as well as X platform kind of leading the example themselves in free speech. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Carr, for your time today. Really appreciate it.